It was just past 10 at night when the red and blue lights flashed in the rearview mirror. The street was quiet, just a few porch lights on, the occasional dog barking in the distance and the hum of tires on wet pavement after a light rain. He'd been driving home from his shift at the VA hospital, where he spent his days helping fellow veterans work through the invisible wounds of war. Tired, but not too tired to notice the patrol car pull up behind him, he slowed smoothly, signaled, and pulled over near the curb. No sudden moves. No music blasting. Windows halfway down. Hands resting on the steering wheel where they could be seen. He'd done this drill before, not because he'd ever been in trouble, but because he'd learned early that being a black man in America meant even the simplest interactions could turn complicated in a heartbeat. The officer approached slowly, flashlight in one hand, radio in the other. License and registration, please. He reached for the glove compartment, slowly, deliberately, and pulled out his registration. Then, with the same calm care, he handed over his driver's license along with his military ID. "I'm a Marine," he said quietly. "Just heading home." The officer glanced at the IDs under the glow of his flashlight, then back at him. "Step out of the vehicle." There was no explanation. "No, sir. No, do you mind?" Just a command, sharp and final. He hesitated for just a second, not out of defiance, but out of disbelief. He'd done nothing wrong. But he knew better than to argue. He opened the door, stepped onto the sidewalk, and kept his hands visible. "Turn around. Place your hands behind your back." Again, no reason given. No mention of a weapon. No suspicion of anything beyond a broken taillight, which, by the way, he hadn't even known was out. But now 2 more patrol cars rolled up. 4 officers surrounded him. One of them grabbed his wrists and snapped on the cuffs, tight, cold, and humiliating. Neighbors began to appear on their porches. A woman in a robe held her phone up, recording. Another man stood in his driveway, arms crossed, shaking his head. He didn't say a word. What could he say? He'd served 2 tours overseas, carried a rifle through dust-choked valleys where every shadow could hide an enemy, risked his life more times than he cared to count. And now here, on a quiet American street, he was being treated like a criminal for no reason other than the color of his skin. "Do you know why you're being detained?" one officer finally asked, as if the answer wasn't painfully obvious. "I don't," he replied, voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. "I haven't done anything." "You were being uncooperative," came the response. He almost laughed. Uncooperative. He'd handed over his documents without protest. He'd followed every instruction, but arguing wouldn't help. He'd learned that too, on the battlefield and off. Sometimes silence was the only armor you had. They searched his car, tossed his gym bag onto the wet pavement, checked under the seats, in the trunk, even the spare tire compartment. Found nothing, of course. No drugs, no weapons. Just a water bottle, a notebook filled with notes from therapy sessions, and a faded photo of his unit taped to the sun visor. After nearly an hour, they told him he was being charged with failure to comply and resisting arrest. Charges that made no sense to anyone who'd actually seen what happened. They put him in the back of the cruiser, the plastic seat cold through his thin VA polo shirt. As they drove off, he caught one last glimpse of his car, sitting alone under the streetlight, doors wide open, like a symbol of everything that had just been violated. At the station, they processed him like any other suspect. Fingerprinted, photographed, asked the same questions over and over, as if repetition would somehow make the story change. He gave short, honest answers. No attitude, no anger, at least not the kind that showed. Inside, though, something burned. Not rage exactly, more like grief. Grief for the country he'd sworn to protect, and for the disconnect between the uniform he'd worn with pride and the way he was treated the moment he took it off. He was released on his own recognizance before dawn, told to appear in court the following week. His ride home was a rideshare driver who barely spoke, probably sensing the weight in the back seat. When he finally walked through his front door, his dog, a scrappy terrier mix he'd adopted after his last deployment, greeted him with frantic tail wags and soft whines, as if sensing something was wrong. He sat on the edge of his bed, still in the same clothes, staring at the wall. He thought about calling someone, his old squad leader maybe, or the VA counselor he usually helped, not the other way around. But he didn't, not yet. He just sat there feeling the ghost of the handcuffs on his wrists, wondering how many other men like him had been through this and never said a word. What he didn't know then was that someone had already seen the video. A neighbor had posted the footage online, the calm way he'd complied, the sudden escalation, the unnecessary force. It hadn't gone viral yet, but it had reached the right eyes. And in a quiet office at the Pentagon, a 4-star general watched it twice, then picked up the phone. But that was still days away. For now, all he had was the silence of his apartment, the soft breathing of his dog at his feet, and the heavy truth that no amount of service, no medals, no sacrifice, seemed to guarantee basic respect once you stepped off the base and back into the world. He finally stood, walked to the bathroom, and splashed cold water on his face. In the mirror, he saw the same man who'd stared down insurgents in the Hindu Kush, the same man who'd carried wounded brothers to safety under fire, the same man who believed deep down in the promise of this country, even when it failed to see him. He took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and whispered almost to himself, "I didn't survive all that, just to be broken here." Then he turned off the light and went to bed. Court was in 6 days, and he wasn't going to let this define him, but he wasn't going to let it go either. The morning of the court date arrived gray and overcast, the kind of day that feels like it's holding its breath. He woke before sunrise, not because of an alarm, but because his body remembered stress like an old language. He showered, shaved carefully, and put on a clean button-down shirt. Navy blue, plain, no logos. Nothing flashy, nothing that could be misread. He didn't wear his uniform, not because he wasn't proud of it, but because he wanted to be seen as a person first, not just a symbol. He walked into the courthouse alone. No lawyer, he couldn't afford one, and public defenders were stretched thin. He'd done his research, printed out his service records, his discharge papers, even a letter from the VA supervisor praising his work with veterans. He tucked them into a manila folder, fingers brushing the edges like they were armor. The courtroom was small, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, wooden benches worn smooth by years of anxious people sitting exactly where he now sat. Back straight, hands folded, eyes forward. A few others waited for their cases. A teenager with a traffic ticket, an elderly man disputing a parking fine, a woman clutching a stack of medical bills. Normal lives, ordinary problems. His felt anything but ordinary. When his name was called, he stood slowly, walked to the front, and faced the judge, a woman with silver hair and tired eyes who'd probably seen it all. The officer who'd arrested him was already there, standing stiffly in uniform, reciting the charges like lines from a script. Failure to comply, resisting arrest, suspicious behavior. The words hung in the air like smoke. He opened his mouth to speak, to explain that he'd done everything asked of him, that he'd shown his ID, that he'd never raised his voice, but before he could get a word out, the heavy courtroom doors creaked open, every head turned. A man stepped inside, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the kind of quiet authority that didn't need to announce itself. He wore a crisp military uniform, so immaculate it seemed to glow under the dull lights. Ribbons lined his chest in perfect rows. Medals earned in places most people only saw on the news. 4 silver stars gleamed on his shoulder boards. A 4-star general. The bailiff stiffened. Even the judge sat up a little straighter. Whispers rippled through the room. No one expected this. Least of all him. He stared, stunned, as the general walked down the center aisle. Not with swagger, but with purpose. He stopped just behind the defendant's table, then nodded respectfully to the judge. "Your Honor," the general said, his voice calm but carrying, "I request permission to address the court." The judge blinked, then nodded slowly. "Granted." The general turned slightly, not to the bench, but to the man standing there, still in his civilian clothes, still holding that manila folder like a lifeline. For a moment, they just looked at each other. No words, but in that silence, something passed between them. Recognition, respect, maybe even shared pain. Then the general faced the court again. "I'm here not in my official capacity," he began, "but as a fellow American who believes in justice, and as a leader who owes this man an apology." A hush fell over the room. Even the clock on the wall seemed to tick softer. "I've reviewed the body cam footage," the general continued. "I've read the police report, and I've spoken with this Marine's commanding officers, his fellow service members, and the veterans he now helps heal. What happened to him wasn't just a mistake. It was a failure. not just by one officer but by a system that should know better. He paused, then added, "This man served in combat zones where one wrong move could mean death. He carried the weight of his team's survival on his shoulders. He came home not looking for praise but to keep serving, this time by helping others carry their burdens. And yet for doing nothing more than driving home at night he was treated like a threat." The general's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Every word landed like a stone in still water. He didn't resist. He complied. He identified himself clearly. And still, he was handcuffed, humiliated, and charged with crimes that never happened. That's not law enforcement. That's fear dressed up as procedure. The officer shifted uncomfortably. The judge's expression had changed, from neutral to thoughtful, maybe even troubled. The general turned slightly again, this time looking directly at the man in the defendant's chair. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "On behalf of every uniform you've ever worn and everyone you represent, I'm sorry you had to go through this." The words weren't grand. They weren't rehearsed. They were human. And in that moment, something inside the man cracked, not in defeat but in relief. He hadn't been imagining it. He hadn't been overreacting. Someone saw him. Truly saw him. The judge cleared her throat. "Thank you, General," she said quietly. Then she turned to the prosecutor. "Given the testimony and the circumstances, I'm dismissing all charges with prejudice. This case is closed, no fine, no record, no warning, just over." The general gave a small nod, then stepped back. But before he left, he placed a hand briefly on the man's shoulder, just for a second. A gesture that said more than any speech could. As the courtroom emptied, people lingered, some glancing back with something like awe, others with quiet shame. Reporters who'd somehow gotten wind of the general's appearance waited outside, microphones ready. But the man didn't stop for them. He walked out the side door into the cool morning air, breathing deeply for the first time in days. The general caught up with him near the courthouse steps. They didn't hug. They didn't make a scene. They just stood there for a moment. Two men who'd given years of their lives to a country that didn't always give back. "You did the right thing coming here," the general said. "I almost didn't," the man admitted. "I thought maybe it wasn't worth it." "It's always worth it," the general replied, "especially when you're standing up not just for yourself, but for every other person who's been made to feel small for no reason." They exchanged a few more words, quiet, personal, not for cameras or headlines. Then the general got into a waiting sedan and drove off, leaving the man alone again. But this time he didn't feel alone. He walked to his car, the same one that had sat abandoned on the roadside that night. He opened the door, ran a hand over the steering wheel, and for the first time since the stop he smiled, just a little. Back home, his dog greeted him like he'd been gone for weeks. He knelt down, scratched behind the dog's ears, and whispered, "We're okay, buddy. We're okay." He didn't know what came next. But he knew this: he wouldn't stay silent. Not because he wanted fame, but because someone else might be going through the same thing right now, and they needed to know they weren't crazy. They weren't wrong. And they weren't alone. The sun broke through the clouds as he stood up looking out the window. The day wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like it might turn out all right. The video hit the internet like a slow-burning fuse. At first it was just a local news clip, grainy, shaky, shot from a neighbor's porch. But then someone clipped the courtroom moment. The general walking in, the quiet apology, the judge dismissing the charges. That part spread fast. Within 24 hours it was everywhere. On morning shows, late-night commentary segments shared in group chats pinned to community boards. People weren't just watching. They were talking. He didn't seek it out. In fact, he avoided his phone for 2 days straight. He needed space to breathe, to feel like himself again. Not a headline, not a symbol, just a man trying to make sense of what had happened. But the world wouldn't let him disappear. His voicemail filled up. Old squad mates called from across the country. Even his high school football coach left a message. "Proud of you, son." Then came the interview request. From a major newspaper, not a tabloid, not a gossip site. A real journalist. Someone known for covering veterans with depth and care. At first he said no. He didn't want to be turned into a story. But then he thought about the young guys he worked with at the VA, the ones who came in angry, ashamed, convinced no one would ever understand what they'd been through. If his voice could help even one of them feel seen, Wasn't that worth stepping into the light? So he agreed. They met at a quiet cafe near the VA hospital, early in the morning before the rush. No cameras, just a recorder and 2 cups of coffee. The journalist didn't lead with the arrest. Instead, she asked, "What made you join the Marines?" He talked about growing up in a neighborhood where opportunities were thin and futures felt uncertain. About how the recruiter showed up at his school with a promise, discipline, purpose, a chance to be part of something bigger. He hadn't joined for glory. He'd joined because he wanted to prove to himself, to his family, that he could rise above the odds. He described boot camp, the exhaustion, the yelling, the moment he realized he was stronger than he'd ever believed. Then deployment, the heat, the dust, the weight of the rifle in his hands, the responsibility of watching over his brothers. He spoke about the silence after a firefight, when the only sound was your own heartbeat in the wind. About carrying a wounded friend 2 miles through rough terrain, because medevac couldn't reach them. About the guilt that stayed long after the medals were handed out. "And after?" the journalist asked gently. "After I came home," he said. But home didn't feel like home anymore. Too quiet, too normal. So I started volunteering at the VA, listening, helping others find their footing. That's where I was coming from that night, the hospital. Just heading home. He paused, then added, "I didn't think my service would protect me from being profiled. But I guess I hoped it might make people pause. Give me the benefit of the doubt." It didn't. The journalist didn't interrupt. She just let the silence sit. When the article ran 3 days later, it wasn't sensational. No dramatic headlines, just a quiet, powerful piece titled, "He Served His Country." Then he was treated like a suspect. It included quotes from his commanding officer, who called him one of the most disciplined, level-headed Marines I've ever led. It mentioned the general's courtroom appearance, but focused more on the everyday reality, that for many black veterans, taking off the uniform doesn't mean the battle ends. The response was overwhelming, not in a flashy way, but in a deep, human way. Veterans from all branches wrote letters. Teachers shared the article with their students. A police chief in another state reached out, asking if he'd speak to his department about bias and veteran experiences. Even strangers sent notes, "Thank you for your honesty. Your courage gives me hope. My son wants to join the Marines now because of you." But the most unexpected call came from the general himself. Not through an aide, not via email, a direct line late one evening. "I read the piece," the general said. "You told the truth without bitterness. That takes real strength." They talked for nearly an hour, not about policy or press, but about the weight of leadership, the loneliness of being the only one in a room, and the quiet pride of serving without expecting applause. Before hanging up, the general said something that stuck with him. "This isn't just your story anymore. It belongs to everyone who's been made to feel invisible, and that means you've got a responsibility, not to be a hero, but to keep showing up as yourself." Meanwhile, the local police department issued a formal statement. They apologized, announced mandatory de-escalation training, promised to review their procedures for stops involving veterans and people of color. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't enough for everyone. But it was a start. He didn't celebrate. He didn't post about it on social media. Instead, he went back to work at the VA, sat across from a young Marine struggling with nightmares and listened, really listened, just like always. But something had shifted. Not in the room, but in him. He carried himself differently. Not with arrogance, but with a quiet certainty that his voice mattered. One afternoon, a new patient walked in, nervous, eyes darting, hands clenched. During their session, the young man admitted he'd been pulled over twice in the past month, both times for no clear reason. "I keep thinking, maybe I did something wrong," he said, voice barely above a whisper. He leaned forward. "You didn't," he said. "And you're not alone." For the first time, he shared his own story, not as a cautionary tale, but as proof that dignity can survive even when the system fails you. Later that week, he received an invitation to speak at a national conference on veteran mental health and racial equity. He almost said no. Public speaking wasn't his thing. But then he remembered the general's words. "Keep showing up as yourself," so he said yes. He didn't know it yet, but that speech would be the spark for something bigger, something that would reach Congress, change policies, and give thousands of veterans a new kind of support. But none of that mattered in the moment. What mattered was this: he was no longer just trying to move on. He was choosing to stand up, and in doing so he gave others permission to do the same. The invitation to speak at the National Veterans Conference arrived in a plain white envelope, the kind that usually held bills or official notices. He almost tossed it aside without opening it, but something made him pause. Maybe it was the weight of the paper or the way his hands had stopped shaking every time the phone rang. He'd said yes to the newspaper interview. He'd started talking more openly at the VA. Maybe it was time to go a little further. The conference was held in a big convention center in Washington, D.C., a place he'd only ever seen on TV. He arrived a day early, not to sightsee but to walk the halls, get used to the space, calm the nerves that buzzed under his skin like static. He wore a simple dark suit, no medals, no patches, just a man with a story to tell. Backstage, organizers handed him a mic and a glass of water. "You've got 15 minutes, they said. Say whatever's true." He stepped onto the stage to a room full of people, veterans of every age, race, and branch, along with counselors, policymakers, and a few reporters in the back. He didn't read from notes. He just spoke from his chest. He talked about the night he was pulled over, not with anger but with clarity. About how it felt to be treated like a threat after years of protecting others. He spoke about the courtroom, the general's unexpected entrance, the quiet power of being believed. But most of all, he talked about what came after. The silence, the doubt, the slow return to himself. "I didn't want to be a symbol," he said, voice steady. "I just wanted to go home. But sometimes your story chooses you, and if it can help someone else feel less alone, then maybe it's worth sharing." When he finished, the room didn't erupt in cheers. It went still, then rose slowly in a standing ovation that lasted so long his eyes burned. Afterward, people lined up to talk to him. A woman in an army jacket hugged him and whispered, "My brother went through the same thing. Thank you for saying it out loud." A retired Navy corpsman handed him a folded note. "You gave me the courage to file my own complaint." But the real surprise came 2 days later, when a congressional aide called. A senator had seen the speech. She wanted to meet. They met in a quiet office on Capitol Hill. Wood-paneled walls, American flag in the corner, sunlight streaming through tall windows. The senator, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense handshake, didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I've heard from 3 different veteran groups since your talk," she said. "They all say the same thing. This happens more than anyone admits. And there's no system to catch it." She leaned forward. "What if we change that?" Over the next few weeks, he met with her team. Not as a politician's prop, but as a consultant. They asked him questions. What would have helped that night? Who should police talk to before escalating with a veteran? How do you train officers to recognize trauma? Not just threat. He brought in others. Veterans who'd been profiled, mental health professionals, even a few open-minded law enforcement trainers. Together, they sketched out an idea. A national liaison program connecting local police departments with VA offices and veteran service organizations. Officers would get quick access to verify if someone they stopped was a veteran, and if so, connect them with support, not cuffs. The program would also include mandatory training on military culture, PTSD, and implicit bias. They called it the HOA Initiative, not because he wanted his name on it, but because the senator insisted. "It's not about fame," she told him. "It's about making sure your experience leads to real change." The bill was introduced quietly at first, tucked into a larger veterans support package. But once the media caught wind, Marines Ordeal Sparks' new federal proposal, it gained momentum. Veterans groups rallied behind it. Even some police unions, tired of being painted as villains, saw it as a practical tool to reduce unnecessary confrontations. Back home, life kept moving. He still showed up at the VA every morning, still made coffee for the front desk staff, still took his dog for long walks in the evening. But now when he passed a patrol car, he didn't tense up, not because he trusted the system completely, he knew better than that, but because he was no longer powerless in it. One afternoon, a local news crew showed up at the VA, asking for a comment on the bill's progress. He agreed, but only if they also interviewed the young Marine he'd been working with, the one who'd been pulled over twice. "This isn't just my story," he told the reporter. "It's his too. The segment aired that night. It showed the two of them sitting on a bench outside the hospital, talking like old friends. The younger man, soft-spoken but clear-eyed, said, "I used to think speaking up would make things worse. Now I know silence is what keeps it broken." The next day, the VA director called him into her office. She didn't offer a promotion or a raise. Instead, she asked if he'd help design a new peer support training module, one that included conversations about race, identity, and how to navigate civilian life after service. "You've got a gift," she said. "Not for drama. For truth," he smiled. "I just say what I see." As the weeks passed, the bill moved through committee. There were setbacks, budget concerns, political delays, but the core idea held strong. Even lawmakers who rarely agreed on anything found common ground here. Supporting veterans shouldn't stop at the base gate. Then came the call from the Pentagon. The general wanted to meet again. They met not in an office, but at a small memorial garden near the VA. No uniforms, no titles, just two men sitting on a bench beneath an oak tree. The general didn't talk about politics. He talked about legacy. "You didn't just clear your name," he said. "You opened a door for others to walk through. That's leadership." They sat in silence for a while, watching birds flit between branches. Then the general added, "There's talk of recognizing your service properly, not just for what you did overseas, but for what you're doing now." He shook his head. "I don't need another medal." "Maybe not," the general said gently. "But the country needs to see that service doesn't end when the uniform comes off." He didn't argue. He just nodded. Later that night, he sat on his porch, dog at his feet, looking up at the stars. He thought about all the nights overseas when the sky was the only thing that felt familiar. He thought about the courtroom, the conference stage, the quiet conversations that mattered more than any headline. He wasn't a hero. He was just a man who refused to disappear, and in doing so, he'd helped build something that might outlast him. A bridge between worlds that too often misunderstood each other. That was enough. More than enough. The bill hadn't passed yet. But for the first time, he believed it could. And that belief, quiet and steady, felt like its own kind of victory.